All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour. Now, today, of course, happens to be a day of a few setbacks for the United States of America. The United States, remember, is the world's largest economy. The country also has the world's most powerful military. It also has a huge amount of sway over other nations with its diplomatic clout. And it is the United States of America that has backed the Israeli offensive on the Gaza Strip with weapons, supplies and diplomatic cover in which over 32,000 Palestinians have been killed so far. But there seems to have been a few setbacks that the United States has come up against, and on your screens are three images. At the United Nations Security Council, the United States has failed to pass a draft resolution for a ceasefire on the Gaza Strip. In the State of Israel, the US Secretary of State was rebuked by the Israeli Prime Minister. Netanyahu said that under his leadership, Israel will continue to push on with its Gaza offensive, even without the American support if need be.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The sham election process in the temporarily occupied territories.
And also what is important to highlight is that the Houthis have continued to challenge the Americans. The U.S. Navy has said that the Yemen-based rebel group is the biggest challenge to the U.S. since the World War II in that region, in those waters. The U.S. drafted resolution calling for a ceasefire in the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict was vetoed by Russia and China. Russia's ambassador was scathing in what he had to say. He said that the resolution was exceedingly politicized and contained an effective green signal for the Israelis to mount a military incursion into Rafah. Listening to what he had to say.
Colleagues, today the United States put forward a resolution in good faith after consulting with all council members and after multiple rounds of edits. The vast majority of this council voted in favor of this resolution. But unfortunately, Russia and China decided to exercise its veto.
In Tel Aviv, the American Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with the Israeli Prime Minister on his sixth visit to the country since the 7th of October. But despite the American pressure, Netanyahu has said that Israel will carry out a ground offensive in Gaza's Rafah without American support in order to defeat Hamas. Now, clearly, Blinken will have to return to Washington once again empty-handed, but it must be highlighted that although the Americans have said that an incursion into Rafah is a red line, the Americans have not said that they would stop sending weapons to Israel if Israel carries out its invasion of Rafah.
I
also said that we have no way to defeat Hamas without entering Rafah and eliminating the rest of the battalions there. And I told him that I hope we will do it with the support of the United States. But if we have to, we will do it alone.
Now, the United States, remember, has deployed its top naval assets in the Red Sea despite multiple airstrikes on the Houthi rebels. The attacks on merchant ships continue. The Houthis, who are backed by the Iranians, have now become even more emboldened and have started attacking American naval ships as well. And they say that they're doing this in solidarity with the Palestinians, who are under the pump by the Israelis. And the Israeli offensive is, of course, backed by the Americans. Now, according to reports, the U.S. carrier strike groups are now trying to protect them, and they've also come under constant threat as well. The Houthis emerged as a pretty big threat to the U.S. Navy since the end of the Cold War. There's more perspective on this. We're being joined in by our correspondent Susan Tehrani, who's joining us live from New York. Susan, now the United Nations, the American resolution, in fact, failed to pass. What reactions have you got from the countries in New York? Because Russia and China have slammed this resolution by the United States, saying that it does not go far enough in calling for an immediate ceasefire. And it also mentions the state of Israel only once when it is to call for a ceasefire.
It does. And reading the text, it does mention Israel by name only once, but there are numerous times that it's calling for an humanitarian aid into Gaza, and other aspects of the resolution really indirectly mentions Israel by name. We saw the reaction from the U.S. ambassador. She said that it was petty when she walked out of the Security Council, that Russia just doesn't want to support a resolution put forth by the United States. The Russian ambassador, we heard, said that it's extremely politicized. As you mentioned, it doesn't go far enough. Another country that also vetoed it was Algeria, which you may remember had put up a resolution prior to this on the part of Arab states to call for basically a ceasefire. It did call for the release of hostages, but it didn't put it as a precondition for the United States and some Western countries. The issue is if all-out ceasefire indefinitely is announced, then that would put Hamas once again in power of the Gaza Strip, and that's something that the United States, as Israel's ally, is not going to go along with. But I do want to say, you know, Mohammed, this is just another example of how Security Council resolutions work. I mean, this is about Gaza, but if you remember about Ukraine, there's always going to be a veto from opposing sides like Russia and China on the one hand, usually, and then the United States and Western countries on the other. So, you know, we'll have to see if this institution really can get itself together and agree on something.
Right. And also, Susan, considering what is happening at this moment in the Gaza Strip and the criticism that has been leveled against the United States, is it doing enough to lean on Israel to try and bring about a ceasefire? Now, the American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was in his 6th trip to West Asia. He met with the Israeli Prime Minister. And the Israeli Prime Minister has gone so far as to say that Israel will go ahead with its offensive of Rafah with or without American support. Now, what we haven't heard from the Americans is, though they say that the invasion of Rafah would be a red line, the Americans have never said that they would stop sending weapons to Israel with which Israel is fighting this war if Israel were to invade into Rafah. Have we got any more updates on that front?
Yeah, I mean, that goes just into the bigger picture of American foreign policy under the Biden administration, that it wants to have it both ways. The reason the Biden administration is putting pressure on Israel right now, specifically Benjamin Netanyahu, is because of its domestic support waning, notably among the Muslim community in an upcoming election year. On the other hand, it does have a large Jewish community, and of course, the Israeli lobby on Capitol Hill, which will never agree as America's strongest ally to stop sending weapons. So what President Biden said was premature to say there is a red line without defining what a red line would be. And what would be the red line for America against Israel? Sanctions, no weapons? I mean, that's virtually impossible. So there's a lot of talk, but then, how the United States ultimately proceeds in action is, I think, what we need to look for, as opposed to trying to gain the support of its domestic audience.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Susan Tehrani, for joining us and getting us that perspective there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.